Welcome back, everybody. So I wanted to say a few words at the beginning of this session. This is, for many of us, is a special and important part of the conference. The theme from very early on, as this conference developed, of building bridges and connecting communities is something that's become very central to the way we're thinking about the organisation and the conference. You heard in Cassidy's talk the importance of thinking about communities beyond those we normally talk to or beyond those we think we're talking to. And it's very easy for us to get trapped into talking to the usual people in the usual places. So we thought it was really important to bring a diversity of voices from across the globe to this meeting. And this is what this session is about. This is what the Travel Fellowship Program was largely about. So I hope that you will find something here which is new and exciting, that demonstrates that there is real activity that we should be paying a lot more attention to out in the wider world, because a lot of people do this better than we do it in Europe and North America, and we just don't hear about it enough. So with that, I hope to be excited, to be challenged, and to come away with some new ideas about how we take some of these issues forward. And with that, I want to hand over to Dominique Babini, who is going to chair the session.
Thank you very much, Cameron. I'm Dominique Babini from CLACSO, Consejo Latinoamericano de Ciencias Sociales, a network of 500 research institutions in 37 countries, mainly in Latin America. My activities in scholarly communications and social sciences. And if you excuse me, I will read my short introduction because English is not my first language. This session on working beyond borders, organized together with Cameron Nayland and Leslie Chan, looks at stories of research and knowledge communication from outside Europe and North America. We want to thank the sponsors of the fellows in this panel, fellows who bring cases from two developing regions, Latin America and Africa, two regions that, together with Asia, that has interesting cases in the poster session, are regions which struggle to be active in global conversations without losing sight of giving international visibility to local knowledge production to solve local problems. I want to mention that from where I come, Latin America, is the region of the world with the largest adoption of open access among scholarly journals, which are published and subsidized by universities and other research institutions as part of the work and cost of doing research. More than 80% of journals in Latin America are in open access, a phenomenon which was built in the last 15 years with the development of collaborative and cooperative initiatives managing open access scholarly communications as a commons. The regional portals Cielo and Redalic today have a collection of 1,500 peer-reviewed journals from the region, to which we add university collections of journals in open journal system platforms. Three of the main research universities from the region, la Universidad Autónoma de México, Universidad de San Pablo, y Universidad de Chile, have each of them an OGS portal with more than 100 journals each. Concerning policies, the region has already 3 countries, Peru, Argentina, and Mexico, that have national open access legislation, which requires that publicly funded research be deposited in open access repositories. Let's hear the presentations, and we keep the questions and answers moment for the end of the 3 presentations. Please, Laura.
Great, well, welcome. My name is actually Laura Foster, and I'm an assistant professor of gender studies and affiliate faculty of the law school at Indiana University, Bloomington. And it's my first time at Force 11, so I'm really grateful to be here. And I'm actually going to talk a little bit today about our work that's going on in South Africa, but I must note I don't normally present on the work. I work with a team of researchers and community members in South Africa who normally present on this work. So we can contest the fact that I'm speaking today versus Kath or Tobias that are coming up from South Africa. So I do want to kind of note that. So what I want to do today, and just briefly introducing our work, is I want to ask a different set of questions. So if our job is to think about research communications and think about how to do them better, then I think we need to ask a different set of questions. And this is coming out of the fact that we are working with indigenous knowledge. So one is, who gets to produce scholarly knowledge? And what gets understood as legitimate scholarly knowledge? And why is certain knowledge produced and not others? And who benefits from the production of knowledge? Now, these questions guide my work as a scholar of feminist science studies, and in doing that, I'm not interested in gender per se, but I'm interested in asking about knowledge production more broadly, and how different elements of power and inequality are structuring the way science and research is done. And these questions also very much guide our work in South Africa, where the team of us have worked closely with indigenous peoples around questions of indigenous knowledge, biodiversity, and intellectual property rights. But the question I want to mainly focus on is who gets to produce scholarly knowledge? Now, in 2014, a team of researchers who included academics, lawyers, nonprofit researchers, indigenous community leaders came together and wanted to do a project on climate change. Right? And where this is a variety of different disciplines, different institutions, and much different ways of thinking and knowing about research. So it's a very collaborative and disparate team. And the need of this research really arose out of the experiences that we had working together and with different indigenous communities. And in particular, Cecil Lafleur and William Links, who are the chairmen of the indigenous Griqua peoples in South Africa and the indigenous Nama peoples, had really wanted to start thinking about how their communities were understanding climate change, what information they wanted to think about climate change, because as they were making claims for land, they wanted to think about how that land had been affected by climate change. So as a team, we actually really started off in the design of the project as imagining a very truly collaborative project where research interests were going to flow from the indigenous community members and then the variety of different people that were working on the team. Right? And we really wanted not just to think about climate change, but think about the process of thinking about climate change. So we wanted to examine how doing open and collaborative research among us requires very different considerations because we were working across these different groups and with indigenous knowledge. So we started off, we needed funding, and we were able to get a grant through the Open and Collaborative Science and Development Network, led by our own Leslie Chan. Cameron was also involved. And so we finally got the funding to actually move forward on the project, but once we got our funding, we actually had to tweak our project a bit and change our project accordingly. And this really raised questions for us that who gets to produce knowledge? Are those who meet the demands of funders? Right? So we had to do that work. And then we had to get approval from our institutional review boards. And the IRB gave us the opportunity, as many of you might work on, to actually work on the protection of indigenous peoples and vulnerable groups that we were working with us. But we also saw it very much as a chance to strengthen the collaborative nature of the project. And hierarchies of knowledge production have historically positioned researchers as the ones that produce knowledge, and indigenous peoples as the ones who produce merely data. And we really wanted to challenge these histories, so we actually went into the IRB process as a political intervention. And we thought about the fact that we were going to do this, so we listed the indigenous peoples that we were working with as researchers as well as communities that were going to be interviewed. And then we also provided a lot of historical background, sort of contextualize their history and their knowledge within the context of South Africa, histories of apartheid, histories of colonization. So we really wanted to use this process. But And in doing that, we actually were confronted by the IRB and this sort of pushing back on our efforts because we wanted to go beyond the IRB, but they didn't really let us do that. So they actually thought of the historical information as superfluous, and they warned us that if we were going to list indigenous peoples as researchers, then they would have to take the obviously take the CD, human subjects training modules. And so the IRB, we played around with it, but it was going to be much too difficult to ask indigenous peoples to actually take the training modules. But in doing it and going back and forth with the IRB, it was a really interesting process to think about this space as pushing back. And it actually asked us to think about, who gets to produce knowledge? Is it those who adhere to normative standards of human subject research and those who do not go beyond the IRB? So we started thinking about that. So as we continued our research, we were forced to also confront sort of the automatic assumptions of open and collaborative science and really ask, who gets to produce knowledge? Is it those who are willing to freely and openly share their data? So we really had to confront this question. So in particular, our funders asked us to report our findings and data in open access publications and Creative Commons licenses. And as scholars of intellectual property rights, we absolutely share this value. South Africa is doing tremendous things in terms of open access and open air collaborations with journals and things. So we really wanted to think about this. But it created tensions among the researchers because South Africa, and in terms of University of Cape Town and natural justice, had been very much more on the cutting edge in terms of embracing open access journals, but Indiana University was more skeptical. Right? And then also really got us thinking about this question. So why is it that just as women, people of color, and indigenous peoples have begun to more notably produce scholarly research, are we now being asked to freely and openly share our creative labor? So this was another question that we really wanted to wrestle with. So demands for open access have created tensions, but we've come up with different solutions. So one of the things that created tensions with was a desire to protect indigenous peoples' knowledge. So indigenous peoples have experienced histories of violence that have led to the taking of their lands, histories, knowledge, and this includes experience with researchers. And this means that indigenous groups are sometimes less willing to share their data, less willing to share their knowledge freely without prior informed consent, without benefit sharing contracts, without collaborative consultation. So to counter these histories, our team thought about developing community researcher contracts. And these are contracts between the researchers, institutions, and the Nama and Griqua communities. And the research contracts are very much to sit down and establish the communications that are supposed to happen between the parties and how knowledge should be shared or not. And for instance, the researchers agreed not to share indigenous people's knowledge without their consent, to respect their intellectual property rights, and to not produce knowledge that actually harmed the reputation of the community. And the interesting thing was the contracts were between the indigenous groups and the universities, so they were pushing back on the universities as being accountable, right? And then the interesting thing was the process of negotiating the contracts themselves. So in the way of doing this, what it revealed was how university structures hinder research communications in general, right? And how they sometimes prevent practices of collaborative science. And as contracts, however, they remain limited, they're contracts. So we're still sort of asking, are these contracts actually pushing back on hierarchies of knowledge production? So in closing, our research has made us think very differently about open science and collaborative science. So we take a more critical approach by embracing what loosely we might call situated openness. And this is a way of doing research that assumes knowledge production is situated within particular historical, political, and socio-cultural relations. And it considers how open and shared knowledge practices can democratize knowledge, but it also recognizes that these notions of openness have been embedded within colonial histories that actually used these norms of openness as a legitimate tool for taking indigenous peoples' lands and knowledge. So we recognize some of these histories that openness has been embedded in. And it aims to develop practices of knowledge production that are more responsive to hierarchies of power and inequality. And so collaborative research for us might involve these moments of being shared, open, closed, sharing, and restrictive. So for the future, we're thinking we need a more robust notion of situated openness in order to democratize science in more meaningful ways. Thank you.
See if I can do this. Where's the mouse? Ah, I found it. Here somewhere?
Yep.
Where am I? Ah, yeah. Okay, F5, isn't it?
Oh, yeah.
There. Okay, first I would like to thank sponsors and the organizers for this invitation. It's a fantastic opportunity. My name is Dora Canhos. I'm from Brazil. I'm from CRIA. It's the Centro de Referência em Informação Ambiental. We work with environmental information. And I've been working with biodiversity data systems since the 80s. And my PhD is in science and technology policy, so I look more at data usability and indicators. So before going into the virtual herbarium, I think it's important to say what a virtual herbarium is. It's you can say it's a library of plant samples, basic information. People go out in the field and pick up plants, and they bring it back the information, what they collected, where they collected, when they collected it, who collected it. And that plant sample is dried, and it stays in those cupboards. We have 250 years or more of history of plant collections. So this data is extremely important because some data is things that you can never collect again, urban areas, destroyed areas. When you want to recuperate a destroyed area, you go back to this information to see what grows there. We have a long chain of historical data so we can measure trends. We can see effects of climate change for the future if we know the past. So there are many, many applications for this kind of data. So what is a virtual herbarium? Basically, you have a number of herbarium together, each one using their own data system and structure. So you have to use standards and protocols. It's not only the will to share data, it has to be feasible. So you share standards and protocols. They send their data about species occurrence data and images. It goes to a centralized database that makes a search interface available for people from all over to assess. And besides species and images, a number of tools for people to analyze that data and use it for their own purposes. But that's not all. There are a number of tools that are created to improve data quality, indicators, usage, a number of tools to offer web services, so offer data for other infrastructures, and not only data, not only images, but maps, in our case, ecological niche models. And besides that, we also attend a much larger community that is involved with virtual herbarium, so taxonomists, ecologists, and also produce tools for them to improve not only the quality of the data, but data content, to enlarge in what data is available, to increase the data. So like for cyber taxonomy, annotation systems, lacunas, which are gaps, information gaps and knowledge gaps, and biogeographical systems. I'd like to stress the importance of local e-infrastructures. I believe that only when people are able to organize their own data and to make it available and start exchanging that is that they can start using data and exchanging knowledge. So this is a big step to have a two-way flow of not only data, information, but of knowledge. So this is basic, I mean, ICT advancements are fundamental, but, and this is normally what gets funded. And people forget that there's a whole social network behind this that is just as important or even more important than the ICT part. I think the ICT part is the easiest part, really. If you see here, there's a big relationship between data providers and the ICT people, between data users and ICT people. But thanks to all these advancements, more and more the tools have to be made for these people to talk to one another, to interact, and to work together. So that's, I think, the beauty of these e-infrastructures. Our project, the Virtual Herbarium, began in 2008. Species Link, which is the information basis of the system, began in 2001. So when the project began, it began with 48 data sets. There were 19 herbarium with data online. Okay, this is where, you see, this is the most developed centers of Brazil. There was one in the Amazon here. And with time, you see one herbarium in each state of the country. So there's a geographic scope of the project. We now have over 100 herbarium, Brazilian herbarium online, and 26 from abroad, repatriating data, drawing more international collaboration through that. So we have, most of our herbarium have up to 50,000 samples. So now, thanks to this network, we have one excellent herbarium in Brazil. It's the size of New York, the size of Paris, the size of Missouri. So that's the beauty of these systems. This here is just to show how you add value to the data. This is the data that comes from herbarium. Sometimes they have images. The system can compare images with other herbarium. You can produce charts, you can produce maps, you can see the status of the data through gaps. Ecological niche modeling, this is a collaborative network that are publishing models through a workflow that's made available to them. And we can link the system to existing information like Biodiversity Heritage Library and EOL. And this is fantastic. This is a fantastic project. So we have a lot of information available. These are just examples. Here I want to just mention the convergence of policies. Here we have our research and education network, the internet. These are just the metropolitan areas. They're points in every capital where all the main federal universities are. Here are our data providers. So you see this is very similar. And here are data users. 95% of our users are from Brazil. I mean, the project is, the system is bilingual, but our focus is Brazil. So that's really neat. And usage is fantastic. You see, it's a very scientific system. It's for science. We have 5 million records of plants, and yet last year was 400 million records were used by users. Not matching searches. Matching searches is 10 times that, but actually used by users. Images were over 3 million. We have 1 million images available. Here we can see how they used it, what tools are important or not, and where they're coming from. So who's using it, how they're using everything, this is thanks to the project we have with OCSDNet, with IDRC's funding. It's Open and Collaborative Science and Development Network. So these are our main target users, government institution too for policy, but here we found out that we're also being used by the private sector, NGOs, and K-12. K-12, I thought we didn't have anything for them. So that's something we have to really work into and see how to best offer data for these institutions. This is all on the fly. This is all online also. So we found out thanks to the project with OCSDNet that we do attend botany. This is important for education in botany. 95% of the herbarium that are participating are associated to graduate courses. Most research is done in taxonomy. And a lot is done in fieldwork planning, besides lists of flora and fauna and fungi, endangered species lists, but this is really neat. So now we're targeting our fieldwork thanks to the infrastructure. So research is a tremendous component, but there are many other uses here that we're trying to identify now. This is really neat too. It's an outcome of the project. This chart was it's João Renato Steyman's chart. Here he made the evolution of the virtual herbarium through time. And here you see there's a certain point when Brazilians are describing more species, angiosperm species of Brazil than researchers from outside. So that's where I think it's neat that you're seeing that people are really using the information for their own research in Brazil. This is my second to the last slide. Some challenges that we felt in our project. Large institutions are resilient to change. We find that they're scared of losing their protagonism. When this network comes out so strong and suddenly becomes larger than they are, we have great resistance. How to make data useful and usable to these other communities. We have to start targeting other communities. Governance of virtual institutes. I think we might be able to learn with Europe, because everything in Brazil, when you're talking about virtual institutes, it's all project-based. So what holds people together is the project, is the money involved. That goes away. What's the governance? We don't have any structure in place. And sustainability of EInfrastructures. It's all project-based, and we need long-term support to guarantee its maintenance. Normally, these infrastructures, when the project ends, the infrastructure ends. Everything falls down. This is my last slide. It's the idea. This is my idea of not the future, it's really the present. More and more research is done over problem solving, grand challenges, and according to what the problem is, what the question is, you get researchers from wherever they are from the world. Different fields of knowledge, different cultures, different visions. And what they need is to pick up data and tools from an existing infrastructure. So here can be the virtual herbarium where they need some data. You can have another aggregator that's getting different types of data from different infrastructures. So when this exercise ends, the project ends or whatever, no problem that this goes. This basic part here has to be maintained, has to be up there for other uses. Okay, that's it. These are just some images that are all online, different collections, different herbariums. Some people take live images of the field. These are all herbarium data from all over the place, wood data, just to show how rich the information you get when you are able to aggregate the community. Thank you very much.
Yeah, so this is great. It's very exciting to be part of a panel. This was the dream when I was at Force 2 years ago, or whenever it was in Amsterdam several years ago, and this was one of hearing the word sort of inclusivity, hearing mentions of the public sort of over and over again. We heard it yesterday already, and hearing it repeated first in Cassidy's talk and now again with the other panelists. So this is really exciting to be here. And again, I also want to reiterate my thanks for the Travel Fellowship to be able to participate and be here, as well as the invitation to be on this panel. I'm Juan Pablo Alpra, and I'm an assistant professor at Simon Fraser University now. I've been working with the Public Knowledge Project actually for almost 10 years. And I've been working on looking at scholarly communications in Latin America. I started out first doing some software development for developing the Open Journal Systems platform, which is used by about 9,000 sort of journals, most of them in the developing world. And then started doing research and ended up doing my PhD looking at scholarly communications in Latin America, because I saw that there was a tremendous need to help to support and strengthen what was already happening in the region. And I've gone on now to look at areas in which part of what I want to talk about today is looking at who are the publics that are using this work, because the research that was being done around Latin America was all very much about who was producing and where were the journals and what fields, and it was sort of a study of the production of journals, but there was very little work done around what the usage was. And what I want to talk a little bit about today is some of, especially those non-scholar, non-researcher audiences, which we've already started hearing a little bit about in the other presentations. As Dominique said, I think this is, but I want to just emphasize and reiterate, this is, one of the greatest transformations sort of in scholarly communications in the global north has been this push for open access, right? And in Latin America, this has just been the reality for since even before the internet even existed, right? We've had open access or some version of open access even in an era when there was only printed journals. There was a barter system in place between the libraries, and people would sort of exchange journals, and they would distribute them as openly as they could with the technology of what was available at the time. And when it came time to put things online, it was just the natural thing to do, to just start trying to put everything available openly. And this part of it about being open has never been one that has been sort of challenged, or definitely not challenged as strongly as it has been in the North. It is the reality that we have, the different estimates, but over 70, 80, 90% of the journals that are open access, or I like to say at least they're publicly accessible. There's a lot of confusion sometimes around what licenses, as things are published in multiple places, but they're at least publicly accessible. And this is, 80% of the literature in an entire region of the world that is published in open access. So this is, when you're trying to push for open access in the North, this is a region of the world that has already been doing this. And it's something that when I bring this up over and over again at different scholarly communication events, something that people are very surprised to hear, that, it's like, what, open access is already, you have an entire region where you have 3 countries that have passed laws and legislation to promote open access, and you have thousands of journals that are publishing in open access. This is something that sort of catches people off guard, and I asked the question, what I wanted to talk a little bit about today, some of the lessons that we can learn by looking at, okay, how does this work? How did they do this? And what are the outcomes when you have an entire region of the world that publishes the majority of their research as open access, which means that the public also has the expectation that the research is open access. It's not something that the public expects that this is closed knowledge. And so what I found in Latin America, and what I did for my dissertation work, is to look at Latin America as a bit of a natural experiment, right? You have a region of the world that has a common language, there's a couple of languages, but for the most part, sort of Spanish-speaking region, where you have a whole bunch of different countries, different size institutions. You have all kinds of areas of knowledge that are being published. All open access, it's been like that for so long that the public has an expectation that research that's made available is public. And so it opens up the question, well, if you have this situation where you have thousands of journals being published in a region of the world where the institutions were intended to support the public good, does the public actually want to read this work? So I went about studying this with 2 other portals that Dominique mentioned. Red Lake is one of them, right, where you have, they collectively publish at around 1,500 journals. At the time that I conducted the study, it was around 1,300 between the 2 of them. And when someone was reading an article, after they were on that page where the article was presented for, I think it was 10 seconds, a little question would come up that said, I work in, and they would have the option of answering at a university, in the private sector, for the government, at an NGO, I'm a student, or other, right? And I actually asked different variations on this same question. I asked in different ways to try to understand what are the sort of, asking where do they work, but also I'm interested in this article for, or I'm interested in this research because, right? And trying to understand really this distinction between the public use and the academic use. This is sort of the question that, when Cassidy was talking earlier around how do we identify who are the members of the public? Well, right on the journal platforms, because they collaborated on this project, they allowed me to sort of put a question where I could just directly ask them, are you a member of the public, right? And so that seems like a fairly good way to try to get at the answer. And so I had a sample of, so on the Red Lake portal, this is, I wasn't going to list all of the countries, but there in Red Lake, it's centralized in one, at redlake.org, you have a whole bunch of different countries in Latin America, journals that are primarily published in those regions or that are associated with those regions. I received around almost 70,000 responses, so I had 4 different questions. I asked this sort of the same thing in 4 different ways, so about 18,000 responses per question. About 38% of the people that saw that pop-up actually answered their question on Red Lake. On the Cielo, there's around in a lot of countries in Latin America, but each site has a different URL, and I just only put the surveys on 3 of them, in the Brazil site, the Chile, and the Mexico site. And I asked there, because they have a bit higher traffic, over the same time period that I asked the question, I received almost 176,000 responses. So that's 44,000 responses per time for each of those 4 questions that I asked. And almost half of the people on the Cielo site asked it. And I actually think this has to do with the fact that of how the web pages look. The Cielo site looks like it's an older kind of web page, and I think that people were sort of more ready to accept and answer the questions. It's actually a little unclear why there's such a difference in the response rate, but I think it has to do with a sort of an old-looking site. People felt like they should answer the question to be able to go on, and on the nicer, sort of more beautiful Red Lake site, people were like a little more dismissive of it. But clearly, 44,000 respondents per question and a 50% almost response rate gives me some sense that at least these, these responses and the numbers are somewhat credible. You like how I'm keeping you in suspense about the answer for as long as possible? Okay, this is intentional. So this is what I found. I found, first of all, that the largest group that uses the Latin American journals are students, right? And so here you have a question around, this is journals that are primarily published in the local languages, so in the Brazilian, and the Brazilian case in Portuguese, and the other countries primarily in Spanish. And students are accessing all of this work as they're doing their research for their classes. And I have, if you want to look at my dissertation, you can see some of the breakdown on what sort of level of study they were at, because for one of the, I directed people to a demographic survey where I collected a little bit more information about them. But from these pop-up questions, and this is a composite of the different responses, I just try to sort of aggregate and summarize, because obviously each question had slightly different numbers for each, but about 50–55% of the people were students. And then university staff, and here it's probably primarily faculty, but because the questions were worded sort of, I work at a university, I don't want to presume that those are just faculty. It could be anyone working at the university. Made up, so this is your typical, this is what you envision when you're thinking about who is reading research, right? This is your professors, assistant professors, and so on. Only made up 22–25% of the people reading the research and accessing it. What we find is then on the public side, 6–9%, depending again on the question, were for asking for personal use. There were people like saying, I'm researching for personal reasons, or they work from, or they're accessing it because they're interested because of something that's external to their job and external to their work as an academic. And for professional practice reasons, so again, here I would break it down by different sectors, but when you aggregate the numbers for the different sectors, you find 17–20% are coming at and looking at the research for professional practice reasons. So this, sums up, if you sum up the public side of this, about a quarter or so of their accesses and downloads of open access research from Latin America is coming from non-academics. Right? And this is despite, these journals have not been written in the beautiful prose that Pinker was describing earlier. These are just journals that were intended for scholarly dissemination. Right? So they're intended for an academic audience, but the public, still 25% of the downloads are coming from the public. You can look at, these are two of the individual questions, right, where you look at place of work. Again, so you have the students are 50%, universities, so you kind of get the same sense for like the breakdown by the questions, or reasons for being interested in this article. You would ask for academic reasons, personal, professional practice, and so on. Again, all accessing primary literature that was written, and it's peer-reviewed in some of the best journals from Latin America. When you look by discipline, you see some variance. When you might think, some of the fields that you think would be of public interest, maybe the arts and humanities, they end up having smaller amounts of public use than fields like health and agriculture. So perhaps not surprising to some, but looking at the social sciences and the humanities, you start seeing different breakdowns. Although the arts and humanities, you see the personal use is higher than most of the other, sort of health and arts and humanities have some of the highest personal use, sort of accessing the research for personal reasons. And the professional practice reasons, perhaps not surprisingly, that again, the health and agriculture field are up there. But you can start to get a sense of where is, what kind of research and what kind of work is accessed by the public, what is primarily of just scholarly or academic interest. And so I think from this, we learn what I wanted to sort of end on is look at what are some of the lessons that if we in this community here are paying attention to what's happening in Latin America, what can we actually learn, right? So number one is that open access means public access. So this is, a phrase that John Walitsky, who was my advisor in the book, The Access Principle, he's making the case that this is open access is public access. And what I think we learn from looking at a region of the world where you have so much open access is that the public is interested. And so when you make things open access, you're giving public access, and the public is actually coming and looking at it. The corollary of that is that you have scholarly communications, we have to think about scholarly communications as being for non-scholars as well as for scholars. So all of the things when we're building tools, when we're building new methodologies, when we are in all of the work that we're doing with the kind of things that we want to value, the kind of things we want to reward and incentivize, need to also consider that scholarly communications has to also be targeted at non-scholars because they are coming and they are interested in the work. And the third part, and this is important for me to emphasize, because in Latin America, all of this open access is done through cooperative models. Right? So they're collaborative and cooperative models. And I think that the fact that this is possible, that it's possible to do wide-scale open access to research and research that's relevant to the public can be done through these cooperative and collaborative models. And just the lesson that it's possible to do it that way is something that I think we need to take away. And I've been very into Metalessons as I'm in my second year of being a professor, and as I teach classes, I've been very sort of like, okay, what do we learn about having learned these things, right? So then I try to always be emphasizing the practice of what we're doing. And that I think that, and this is, again, very much echoing what Cassidy was saying this morning, that perhaps some of our biggest challenges, right, for all of the things that we're doing around trying to do semantic linking and machine-readable things, all of the stuff that we are all very concerned with, that perhaps one of our biggest challenges is to adjust our practices and adjusting our values to really be inclusive. And here it's inclusive in every sense. So it's inclusive of different people participating, right, on who gets to participate in the knowledge creation, inclusive of who gets to participate in conversations around what should scholarly communication look like and what kind of things we should do. It's inclusiveness around what voices we allow to influence the work that we do, around who deciding. And these are the questions that were asked by Laura, those sort of provocative questions. It's all about inclusivity in the broadest sense of the term. Thank you.
The stories we are being told in your presentations show diversity of realities, accomplishments, and challenges. I want to put the first question, and then please bring your questions. When you're thinking of the design of new tools and services for research and knowledge communication and use, what makes them inclusive for local voices addressing local needs with different cultures, different values? This is the question.
Okay, is that on? No, yeah. Well, we have been answering demands from the biological community, basically. And although we do have some demands from users, but most users are also scholars. They're the people that are involved with biodiversity, either botanists and zoologists and so on, but they do have a scholarly background. So our tools are normally implemented for that community only. Very little is done with a community that asks, like I get school kids that send me emails and things like that. Then it's just an email, then it's just an information, but not tools. So we're attending the academic community, really.
For me, I think what's important is to, and this is, again, I didn't plan this out with Cassidy, but she was saying a lot of the things that I wanted to echo is this baking in the values that we want into the tools and systems that we need. I think this is one of the things that in Latin America, the fact that these platforms like Cielo and Red Lake are planned out as they have built into their structures of how they're funded, of how they're organized to be open, being collaborative, right? And the fact that they've sort of have structured themselves around with public funding, structure themselves around being inclusive and having cooperation and having sort of networks of people that participate in them. This is how you get tools and how you build a whole system across an entire region that believes and shares in those values. I think you have to bake them in to how you do these things. This is why cooperative approaches to trying to do open access, for example, I think will work much better than approaches that try to be, that try to approach these things for trying to figure out what's the right sort of commercial business model.
I think for us, we probably have a much different sense of what tools might mean to our research projects. It could range for, I mean, tools that facilitate research communications would be a 4x4 to get across the desert. I mean, we actually struggle to have adequate transportation to bring everybody together. So that's a big struggle for us. And then also, I think with the research communications, we found that these researcher contracts between across all of our parties, Natural Justice, Cape Town, Indiana, each community has enabled us to have this structure to boost the communication among us, to really force us to say what are the assumptions, what are the expectations, what are the moments of sharing and non-sharing, and actually having that, albeit limited legal tool, has actually forced us to really think deeply about how we're supposed to communicate and what the expectations are going forward. And so we're working on that as a potential model for other different research practices. So that's been actually kind of exciting to sort of see that develop. And I'd have to say, that's been going on for a year. Imagine trying to negotiate a contract that in depth between multiple parties. It takes a long time. So.
If you have questions for the panelists, please raise your hand. Thank you, Nicole, for your help. Thank you very much.
Oh. The presentations were quite interesting because I'm from Africa, and just like the first speaker spoken, we were quite behind the Western people. But especially the Brazil is considered to be one of the hot biodiversities in the world. And most especially for identification of the plants, there are species similarities and variations. So I would want to ask two questions. For example, the herbarium that does that identification, what do you do about the plant species that are rare, threatened, and extinct? What do you do about those plant species? Then secondly, I've been seeing that the identification is quite difficult, most especially for those that don't have expertise. Have you developed a software that could help you in identifying some of these plant species?
Sorry, I didn't really understand. The first question?
The first question. You know, I've said that, for example, Latin America is one of the hot biodiversities in the world.
Yes, yes.
Most especially Brazil. Then the question, some plants are rare, extinct. And in fact, for some of these plants, how do you do about bringing them, especially preserving, you know, maybe identifying some of those rare plants? That's the first question.
Okay, let me answer one at a time. Rare plants.
Yes, rare plants.
Okay, what we did is each herbarium has their own data policy.
Okay.
Okay, because for rare and endangered plants, some people believe that you cannot put geographic information online and make it available, that people can go there and pick up the plant and finish it. Other people believe that you have to do that because then there's social control.
Okay.
So there's no right or wrong answer. And we went into a whole year debate because of that. So then we decided, no, the best way is for each data provider who holds the information, who holds the knowledge, to be able to decide whether that data can be made publicly available or not. So what data is sent to the network, that's open data. So whatever has to be, and there are tools to help herbarian click on everything that they don't want to send to the data so that that can be automatic.
Okay. Then is there any software that helps you in identification of similar plants, those plants that have similarity?
Identification of similar plants?
Yes. Is there any software? Is there any software?
Software.
Yes.
there are keys for identification, but in terms of the information system, what we did systems that can compare images.
Okay.
You can zoom in, you can measure, you can look at detail. So that's cyber taxonomy, that helps. And another thing, not one collection alone can hold all taxonomists of the groups they have within their data, within their herbarium or zoological collections. So we allow an annotation system. So who's ever searching the system and looks at a certain record and does not agree with that determination, they can send, they can write their comments. This comment is sent to the curator and is published together with that record, with his name and everything. That way, if there's a change of identification and there's a fight about it, both names are going to be there on that record. That's the only way we could help.
So, okay, my last question to the middleman.
Yes.
Then most of the journals from that region of the world are open access. Then don't you think that can affect the quality of the production?
Yes.
Sorry, if I understood that, if they think that the quality of the production of the journals is gone. I think that what it's done in Latin America is that over time, the only real debate that happened around open access, I think, that I detected a lot when I started going around and meeting with journal editors all across Latin America, was a question about doubting whether having things open access and putting things online was going to make them lower quality. And I think that what ended up happening as now that debate has sort of been resolved is that people have realized that the problem of the quality of the work is independent of where it is available. And if anything, putting things online has sort of brought about the issue of quality and made it an issue that needs to be talked about and resolved, because now we have visibility of the research. And as soon as the research is available and accessible, then people have felt that we need to also do something about quality. So if anything, I think that although it was the fear that it was going to lower the quality, I think the outcome has been that the quality of the work has gone up because countries were now starting, and institutions were now starting to feel pressure to make sure, oh, well, if we're putting this online, we need to invest in also improving the quality of the work.
And who bears the largest funding stress?
Sorry. We have only 3 more minutes,
Okay.
and we saw other hands raised. Thank you so much. But then you can share your ideas with the panelists. Thank you so much. Please.
I have a question actually to Laura, but maybe I can reframe it in a way that was inspired by the discussion we just had. So you just said that there are people who believe that it's best to expose that location of those rare species, whereas there are other people who believe that it's best not to expose that. And in a way, you, Laura, had a similar statement, like right now, as we're becoming more conscious of diversity issues, we are now kind of expecting everyone to do things openly. And there is a similar debate there. There are people who believe that this is actually bad for the developing world. And on the other hand, we have people who believe that's actually a big opportunity for the developing world because they can now share in all the resources from the rich as well. And I'm wondering whether you're aware of anyone peeking a little, or drilling a little deeper into those kinds of issues. Because I see lots of those beliefs being expressed, but we're scientists here, so someone's got to drill.
I could make a plug for my own book manuscript that hopefully will be out in the next year.
You should share the draft now.
Yeah, I mean, I think when you're thinking through questions of post-colonial, what I consider post-colonial technoscience, it's precisely those contradictory tendencies and paradoxes that we find in the making of science within these post-colonial conditions, and they're struggling with precisely these questions, and that's what I'm interested. I'm interested in those tensions, and that's why I think that we need these different kind of models to help us untangle those tensions. So I think you actually said it best in your question. I mean, those paradoxes are really real.
I would just like to add something. When you talk about open science between the academics, it's been open for centuries. Not the way we're talking about open access. So between peers, to those closed communities, and the big change with the internet was suddenly you're opening to anybody, and that's the big fear people have. And I really believe it's a process. And the idea of what is really should be open, what shouldn't be. It's just going to be a process that's going to be, in my view, opening throughout time. But it's a process. That's why you can't today say, okay, this has to be open, this can't be open. That's the way I used to act in the beginning. Either it's open or you're out. And it doesn't work. It has to be a process. People have to get used to the idea and have to believe that they profit from the idea. And in the long run, everything I've seen, they do. They get more acknowledgement, they get more funded, everything. They get more visibility.
We have time for one more question. Yes, please. I'm sorry, Nicole. I'm so sorry. This is collaboration. The last question.
Thank you. That was a really fantastic session. And just in passing, it did remind me of being at a museum and digital arts humanities conference, and the issue of access to objects, Indigenous objects in museums is a really complex situation. I was just wondering, Juan, with your research on access to open access in Latin America, whether you'd also looked at the repository, or whether you're considering looking at the repository network and sort of more of a diversity of resources, sort of outside of journal articles that might be taken up more.
Yeah, I've submitted a grant. I'll hear back in June about, because I want to look at, so if there's doctoral students here that are looking for a project, hopefully in June. But the idea is I want to repeat this kind of study that I did on these two portals, actually across across different countries, different journals, and different objects. So this, as soon as, this methodology of just doing a pop-up on someone that is accessing a work is something that's really sort of straightforward to do and implement on any web available resource. And so the idea is to try to sort of replicate this across different kinds of, just different kinds of objects or different kinds of pages, or just across countries, different models of access, right, to see how these things vary.
Let's talk.
So we thank you all very much, and thank you to the panelists.